continuing what I started out with earlier, and Pierre and I have a digital relationship. We've seen each other only on Skype for the last few months. This is the first time we've seen each other in almost a year. So we weren't able to actually physically coordinate this, but I want to just quickly go back to this idea that the towns that were built, the suburbs were never built to be changed. And for the process of governance, the two things that come together is that there's an ongoing process of suburban growth and decline, I should say. That's another thing we need to take into account, the question of what happens to the governance of declining suburbs, shrinking suburbs, and we'll hear something about that this morning. But also the question, how will change inside those urban settlements be governed? What are the principles by which that happens? So what is the core of the governance conundrum is the disconnect between those two central things that we're looking at, suburbanization and suburbanisms. Because as suburbanization sets out a certain path, whether it's state-led or whether it's private-led, like in North America, or state-led like it was here, at one point, the suburbanization process will have to deal with the various suburbanisms that are coming out of that process. And they will be feeding back into the suburbanization process. And that process has to be looked at as part of the governance. And we've already heard about differentiations and convergence, so I'm not going through this. These are the three modalities, just to remind you: the state, capital accumulation, forms of authoritarian action. And when we look at those individually, we can just say the state is not a unified actor. We're not presupposing that the state is doing certain things, because that's what the state does. But it's a multi-scale affair. The state means different things to different people, as we will hear from us tomorrow and from all of you over the next couple of days. The state in Canada, for example, is a federal actor, acts in a specific way. It's quite different from the state in France. So, we need to think differently about the state conceptually and empirically. What is the state good for? What has the state been doing? Issues of social and spatial justice that historically have been associated with what the state does. And very importantly, for those places that are now called older suburbs, for example, like we call those in Canada older suburbs, post-war suburbs, or the housing settlements that you find in West and East Europe, for example, were built in the 60s and 70s. The question is, how will the state, what's the role that the state plays in the rebuilding of those? Then the accumulation of capital is also a differentiated process. There is, again, from the normative case of the United States, and to a bit also Canada and the United Kingdom, where most of the focus has been on property capital as a self-interested actor. Harvey Mollich and John Logan have set us on that track in the 1980s. Growth machines, coalitions that actually built suburbs. There are locational decisions that built suburbs that are now very strongly associated with the new economies since the 1970s, the crisis of Fordism. Here, as just one example, just-in-time production has led to new forms of suburbanization, as you can't have trucks roll through the centers of cities. They need to be servicing production facilities, warehousing facilities along highways and airports. So this is a whole push that has to do with a particular accumulation regime that for the past generation we've called post-Fordist in many parts of the world. There is now, which we know painfully now since 2008, a particular role of finance capital in the development of suburbs, commodification, financialization, and the crisis of the world financial model that, of course, is still lingering in many parts of the world. Then we have something which is tremendously important, the ideological sphere, the governmentality of home ownership, which is immediately integrated into the process of capital accumulation. And then there's this swing of crises between boom towns and ghost towns. Those places that were yesterday's boom towns are today's crash towns, ghost towns, slumburbs, and that is very much tied to the waves of capital accumulation. Privatized authoritarian governance, we'll hear more about that throughout the conference. The governance As we understand it today, the move from governance to government often implies this idea that we're moving to more democracy, to more openness, to more transparency. But in reality, often governance is not naturally more democratic than government. Often governance contains authoritarian, non-accountable forms of governance. It's very important. Gated communities, of course, is the most visible aspect of that modality. Often the hegemony, the dominance of that form of, that modality, private authoritarian, discourages the state from acting as a champion of state justice because it carves out areas, domains of social regulation that are legitimized as market domains and delegitimized as state domains in which the state is being taken authority from and being told that it has no business in these particular forms of governance. So what we also know is that these three modalities are never by themselves. They are never isolated from one another. They always are integrated, intertwined with one another, more or less compatible arenas in which various instruments and technologies of suburban governmentality are being produced. It's interesting now, of course, as the market is the core of the neoliberal change that we have experienced in many parts of the world, the state also, of course, has been neoliberalized and acts as if it was a market. So if we differentiate between the state and capital accumulation, we often have a problem drawing the line between one and the other, as even municipal governments now behave as they were market actors. The state has acted in symbiosis then with the property industry in pushing suburbanization as a self-propelling outcome of governance. And that has to do, again, with the governmentality of it all and these expectations about certain ways of suburban life, that we deserve that. We have an entitlement to own a house in the suburbs. We have an entitlement to own a condominium in an edge city. We have an entitlement to certain forms of life that are associated with certain normative understandings of what suburbanization is all about. And that has to do, of course, with infrastructure. And that is our third topic, which we don't talk about this weekend at all. But in the future, we'll talk more about land and infrastructure, a link to that. And of course, people have certain assumptions about what it entails to live in the suburbs, what you deserve as an individual, as a family, as a household to have, whether you live in the global south or in the global north. So, suburbia is often the dream space in which a lot of people want to live. They want to escape the city to go to the suburbs. In reality, and that's a sociological question that we will answer throughout this workshop, begin to answer throughout this workshop, but also we move towards throughout the project, is that the emergent suburban dream space often turns into a nightmare as suburbs themselves become camps, fenced, secured. That's where I would like to show you that I hit by a video, but we do that in the break. And the conclusions quickly is that these three modalities Pierre and I have suggested and Mike have suggested as the basis for our conversations. They continue to interact, but they are also significantly repositioned as governmentality of suburbanism takes hold. There is a spiral developing here that the modalities lead to particular forms of interacting governance, as then that those particular forms of interacting governance produce new types of suburbanization and new forms of suburbanisms. So what we're looking at is a dynamic process, not a static process, and that's where we're going. And we now are going to new forms of what I would call, as my own personal footnote at the end of this, to new forms of roll with it neoliberalization, in which we are now seeing a not gradual but a very quick shift away from the post-war Keynesian forms of suburbanization in much of the world, but also are moving through forms of roll back and roll out neoliberalization into roll with it neoliberalization, which means we're now in a world that doesn't have a world that can't refer back to what was before, but a world that is contained in itself, and we need to look particularly at the imminent contradictions and dialectics that come from that particular world. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.